Thank you. Good morning. That was good. I don't even think we need a retake on that. Usually I have to do it twice. I am so grateful to be with all of you today. It is just a joy to be here at Full Scale, connecting with other educators, and I think particularly at this time with the sort of political challenges and new attacks on our historically vulnerable and resilient populations and AI. I mean, there's just so much need for us to connect with each other and to connect around the work that we do, as well as human to human. So I'm just so grateful to be here around this really important topic. As you said, I was a former high school English and American history teacher. I was a department chair, assistant principal, worked in school districts. And in the last decade, I've really dedicated my work to supporting teachers to improve their grading practices. This session is going to be about the intersection between improved, more accurate and fair and equitable grading and competency-based education. What is that relationship and why is that intersection so crucial to the success of our work? I'm going to start by framing kind of what that intersection is, and then we're going to hear from some folks in the field. So when we think about competency-based education and educators start going in this direction, they have really grandiose ideas about what they can make their schools. Right? Like the Barbie dream house, right? We're gonna organize classrooms differently. We're gonna have our schedule being different. We're gonna have kids present digital portfolios. We're gonna have them defend their work. Could we have our students run for city council? Could they do like advocacy and internships, like these big, great, wonderful ideas to rethink schools? And sometimes when we start to translate the work into the day-to-day practices of teachers in classrooms, it can seem like a bridge too far, right? Because there's so many elements that we have to figure out, and it can slow us down. And many times these big ideas get relegated to the binder, right? We have this portrait of a graduate we've spent so much time on, but we can't get it to happen in day-to-day experiences of our students. And one of the big questions that we have to tackle in competency-based education work and reform of schools more generally is, how are we going to give feedback and grade and report where students are in their learning in ways that empower them and give them agency and that are accurate and fair to not just our students, but to our parents and families, to colleges, to other folks, right? Where can we kind of get the integrity of our vision to be translated into the integrity of how we communicate information about where students are? And when I say grading, it's not just like the A or whatever it is. It's like giving feedback and communicating where students are. And you can't have these big ideas and at the same time use the traditional grading practices of like, well, I got to give them 5 points every day if they raise their hand. So we have to figure out grading. And what we've seen is that when schools who are aspiring for competency-based education, really reforming how they think about teaching and learning, start to interrogate their grading, it unlocks this new ways of thinking about the work, and it accelerates their progress to competency-based education. It really is an accelerant to get there. And I want to kind of talk about why that is. And so I got to spend a couple minutes talking about grading. Just a quick overview mini lesson, rush through this about what grading is. Why do we talk about grading? When I started teaching, I had no idea about how to grade. I wasn't trained to do it in my graduate work. And so I really thought about grading in two ways. One is it's just a tabulation of data. I got to keep track of everything students do because that's how I establish value and how I give feedback. And if pressed, I got to have some way of defending the grade that I give. And it's not very interesting and it's, not sexy. It's just like the plumbing. Like I just got to deal with it. There's a symphony of teaching and learning, and at the very end, I got to give a grade. Right? And really, it's a lot bigger than that. There are major decisions that are about students based on their grade. And really what I started to figure out is that grading is woven into every pedagogical decision, because every time I ask a student to do anything, I got to decide, am I going to grade it or not? And if so, in what category? It starts to become something I have to think about all the time. And as I found, as I started researching this, is that most teachers, like me, have never been taught how to grade. It's not covered in most graduate education programs or alternative certification programs. When you get a new curriculum, nobody tells you how to grade it. So we as teachers are really left with a very wobbly foundation on which we make decisions about grading. You know, we rely on our own experiences. How was I graded as a student? Or how have I been grading? The culture of the school, you know, my department chair or grade level lead gave me something that said in this place we grade, you know, homework at 40% or whatever. But we don't have access as teachers to the education and research on grading. And there is a big history and research fields around grading. And what's worse, when we try and talk about grading, it's very difficult historically in schools, right? If an administrator comes up to teachers and says, we're going to talk about how you grade, it's not like the teachers are like, hooray! There's 3 different reactions. This is the first, right? No, you don't, right? Which is really reasonable, right? I think I write about how grading is one of the last islands of autonomy that teachers have, professional autonomy. And so we protect this space. We are in the best position to grade our students. Nobody else is in as good a position as us, so we protect it. Or it's this reaction, right? Which is like, oh my gosh, some very passionate parent or somebody is about to put pressure on me to change the grade that I think the student should get, right? And that doesn't feel good. Or it's this reaction. Is that the PD flavor of the month? Now we're going to talk about grade. Fantastic. I'll appear engaged, and then I'll just do what I want because it's my grade book, right? And we want to get past these kinds of conversations, be much more constructive about it, particularly when we consider that having no training and not being able to talk about it has consequences where our grades and report cards look almost identical to 100 years ago, right? This is 100 years ago. Subject, 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 letter, 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 and that's it, right? We're trying to do very different things in schools, but if we house them through our inherited grading practices, we could be undermining all of that work and constraining our own imagination. Because there are several structures, our inherited grading practices, that are actually not moving in the same direction as what we want in our schools. Our inherited grading practices prioritize points over learning. We use them as a behavior management strategy. We incorporate, and they often reflect student circumstances and things outside their control. We apply unsound mathematics and statistical formula in our work, and they're variable and inaccurate. And I want to spend just a minute talking about this last one, an example of how this variability happens, and then talk about the inaccuracy, and then what's better. So when I'm deciding what my grade should be as a teacher, I'm certainly basing it on the student's level of content understanding, right? Maybe based on their tests or summative assessments. But we include a lot of other stuff, like how the students did on their homework and their participation and their extra credit and their growth and their quizzes and their effort, right? Parenthetically, for now, effort, participation, growth are all susceptible to bias and highly subjective, but we're not going to talk about that right now. We're trying to put a whole lot of diverse information into a tiny little container, which Tomlinson calls omnibus grading. So what happens is that every teacher is doing this differently because no teacher has been trained to do this, right? So I can go from classroom to classroom, and every teacher has a different kind of formula and different weighting of all these different things. So now as a student, I not only have to understand all the content of a course, but I have to navigate the additional cognitive load of the grading system of that unique teacher. And then when a student gets a grade, I don't know in what alchemical relationship all the different things are, right? Because you could have a student who has a B who is an expert in the content, but is kind of a knucklehead and comes late every day and doesn't hand in homework. Or a kid could have a B because they don't really know the content very well, but they're an angel in the classroom and they do every extra credit and they do all the homework because their parent helps them and all this stuff, right? So you have this variability that's happening and this ambiguity, and therefore inaccuracy by definition But we wanted to test this, and so this is the study that was referred about. We looked at 33,000 grades and looked in courses for which there was an external standardized test that was designed to measure the content of that particular course, right? So New York Regents exams, AP exam, Louisiana has some end-of-course exams, things like that. And wanted to see the relationship between the grade and the standardized test score for a student. And what we found as we looked at 33,000 pairings is that 60% of them did not match. And of those, 40%, 13,000 grades, had grades that were inflated, meaning the grade the teacher assigned was lower than the standardized test score. And I get that because I'm not a big fan of standardized tests. I know that they cause anxiety and they're very limited in how they measure, and kids can have bad test days, but 40% is a huge percent. And what was really surprising to us is the rate at which grades were depressed. So we saw that 1 out of every 6 grades, so if I'm a student, that means one of my classes that I take each semester was depressed, meaning that the grade the teacher assigned was lower than the standardized test score. It's very difficult to accidentally do well on a standardized test, right? And we found that almost 1,000 of those grades were 2 levels below. So a student may have gotten a D in the course, but a B equivalent on a standardized test exam, right? And what's happening is that students are being given false information about their readiness for the next level, whether it be high school, the next algebra course, college, and may being set up to struggle, and other students are being denied even the opportunity to go to the next level because the grade is showing that they know less and are less competent and less ready than they actually are. And therefore, we are making decisions, and when I say we, this is within the school as well as college admissions officers are making decisions based on inaccurate information. So to figure out how to make grading more effective, more accurate and fair, I looked at lots of related research, culturally sustaining pedagogy, adolescent development, statistics, motivation theory, and looked at it within a larger body of work of assessment and curriculum instruction, and identified 3 pillars of equitable grading. And I'm going to say it really fast, going through this really fast. But it's identifying that we want grades to be accurate. We want them to be accurate reflections of a student's academic understanding of their course content. We want grades to be bias resistant, where they are counteracting institutional biases and preventing our implicit biases from infecting the grade. And we want grades to be motivational, to build students' intrinsic motivation and sense of efficacy and self-regulation. And this is not the time to talk about all these. I'm leading a workshop at 1:45 this afternoon if you're interested, but I just want to sum up that these practices require us to not use the 0 to 100 scale, not include student behaviors, performance on formative assessment work, and others, and instead have the grade reflect a student's academic understanding of course content through multiple opportunities, a different scale with rubrics and proficiency scales to make it transparent and explicit for students. And in doing so, we can give teachers access to this information and build up this third leg. And one of the things that we found that this does is it builds consistency from teacher to teacher, right? This is in a high school, in a biology class, and these are 6 different teachers' grade distributions, right? percent of students getting A, B, C's, D's, and F, or A, B's, D's, C's, D's, and F's. And if you had to guess which teachers are more consistent, have had the training, it's the final 3, right? In those courses, there's a greater confidence that regardless of which teacher you have as a student, you'll get the same grade for the same performance. And finally, I'll talk about, could we make grades more accurate with equitable grading? The second part of this study is where we looked at about 260 teachers, trained them in how to grade more accurately, fairly, equitably, and found that compared to the control group of teachers who were not trained, there was a stronger correlation. And again, I don't love standardized tests, but I like that the grade gets closer. There was a greater reduction in A's, a greater reduction in D's and F's, so less grade inflation and less grade depression. And there was a reduction in disparities for our historically underserved and resilient groups of students. And interestingly, 40% of the teachers said that learning about equitable grading alone made them more likely to stay in their school or district. Teachers know that it's a gap in our knowledge base, and we can empower our staffs and empower ourselves through learning about this work. We've also seen for students is that they have more motivation, more persistence. They don't talk about their learning in the language of points, but instead language of the discipline. And this intersection, when we do this work, we have found when people are focused on making grades more trustworthy and accurate through this work, that they start to imagine new ways of doing lots of aspects of their classroom. And they start with thinking about how am I going to grade homework, and they start thinking about what could be bigger outcomes, what could be different in our school. And they say, a whole new world, right? Like we could do things entirely different. These are schools we've seen who had no thinking really about standards-based education or competency-based education, and equitable grading unlocks these new ideas. So the teachers who are resistant to competency-based education, that's okay, talk about grading, and it'll get them there. And that's part of why it's an accelerant in the other direction, right? We can align our day-to-day practices and accelerate our progress toward our vision by examining grading. All right, enough from me. I think what we really want to hear from now are practitioners, people in the field who have encountered this intersection, to hear about what that has been like, what are the challenges they've had, and what is that journey for them. So I would like to invite some folks to join me now. I'd like to invite Ray Lee, a graduated senior from Clark Street Community School in Wisconsin, Dr. Sonal Patel from San Leandro Unified School District in California, Dr. Jill Gertner, the former principal of Clark Street Community School and founder of Community School, and Dr. Alan Chang, superintendent of New York City Public Schools. Would you join me in welcoming them to the stage now? Give me a high five. To not get dapped back by a student is humiliating, so thank you for saving me on that, Ray. Well, welcome, all of you. Thank you for joining us. So we'll just jump right in. I'd like to ask you each to respond to this question. We'll start at this end and work our way down. And the question is sort of, how did you encounter that intersection between improved equitable grading and competency-based education?
All right. Morning, everybody. I'll answer that question, but I want to start with a little joke, which is I sent a photo of this room to my wife this morning, and she was like, "This many people want to hear you talk about grades?" I was like, "Oh, you just wait. This is going to be good." Because this is actually really, truly at the heart of what it is that we've been working on for the last 30 years. I'm a high school superintendent. Really, the most favorite part of my job is visiting classrooms. I do about 500 classroom visits a year. So over the course of my superintendency, that is several thousand visits. And when I go into a classroom, I'm not paying attention to what the teacher is doing. I pull up a chair, I sit next to a student, and I ask him 3 questions. What are you working on? Why? Why are you doing what you're doing? And how do you know if you're doing a good job? And I can ask that to a 6th grader. I can ask that to a senior in biology class. And those answers reveal so much about who the school is designed for, whether or not this is an equitable school, and whether or not this is a system that trusts young people to think. And I think that is crucially important. And so in New York City, I oversee 51 public high schools. These schools, part of the consortium, Internationals, and Outward Bound School District, are designed to really ultimately change our entire school system. And many of these schools trace their lineage to the Coalition of Essential Schools, to people like Debbie Meyer, Ted Sizer, Ron Berger, who really believed that ultimately what school should be about are places where students are expected to show what they know through meaningful work and not just through compliance. And really, the truth is we did not start with equitable grading. What we started with was a vision for what authentic learning is supposed to look like. And for us, that means students motivated through project-based learning, student interest-driven internships, performance-based assessments, and portfolios where students are expected to be able to publicly defend their ideas, not just in front of their teachers, but in front of their peers, community members. And those experiences ultimately demand a very different kind of grading, one that is rooted in evidence, revision, and reflection over time. And so as we work with our teachers, if you're really trying to assess and deeply understand that complex, creative work and to do it fairly and accurately, you run into the limits of traditional grading very quickly. And so, if you have averages that erases growth, if you have penalties that are punishing students as opposed to motivating them, we realize that the way that we graded reinforced inequities unless we changed it. And so for us, the idea of working on grading and grading reform was not a side project. It really became the structure that ultimately said performance-based and competency-based learning, we need to be able to, in order for them to be much more credible and sustainable, that's what we had to put into place. And so when we really started to be able to grade for growth instead of ranking for control, so much got unlocked. Assessments really became feedback, curriculum becomes design, and schools become places where students earn trust through evidence and not just through compliance. And so to answer the story about how these things are connected, that it is in this deep, deep belief in students' capacity for depth and for growth, and that our grading had to evolve in order to be able to honor that.
Thank you. Dr. Gertner. Oh.
Good morning, everyone. So I also want to start by just centering in the place that I am doing this work or have been doing this work. Clark Street Community School is located in Middleton, Wisconsin, right outside of Madison, a first-ring suburb of Madison, Wisconsin in Dane County. And those of you that know anything about Dane County has the most inequitable results for students of color in the country. We are a relatively resource-rich area. We say all the right things. We have educators and schools who are working really, really hard to do the right things, and we're failing. And we've been failing for a very, very long time for our students of color, for our LGBTQ plus students, for our students with disabilities. When you disaggregate our data, it doesn't look anywhere near as good as it does when we get celebrated for being the #1 high school in the state or the best place to live in the United States. The results are very, very different based on who you are and what your background is and where you come from. And I just retired after 30 years as a principal in the Middleton Cross Plains Area School District. And came always with the vision of I want education to be that great equalizer. I wanted to believe that that was actually possible. And here I was in this place that was amazingly full of resources, and we weren't doing it. And so about 15 years into my career, I had the opportunity to work with an amazing group of educators. In Wisconsin, we have charter law that allows school districts to sponsor charters. And the idea is that it gives school districts the ability to innovate. So we are within a public school system. We are co-located with a traditional high school that does indeed get ranked as the #1 high school in the state quite often. And we had the opportunity to build the Barbie Dream House. And at that time, we were really talking about Phil Schlechty's work. And Phil Schlechty was looking at schools and levels of participation for students. And the ultimate outcome of his research was, by design, schools get, at best, strategic compliance. They aren't designed to get deep engagement in learning. And so we threw out this big question of like, what would it look like? What would it look like if we were designing for deep engagement? And so when the question of grading came up, it was a really, I say easy, but that's of course not the right word, answer at that time of like, we can't use grades because the research was clear that grades were a demotivator for engagement. So we set off to give kids voice and choice and do all those things. Like, it resonated with me a lot, all of the amazing things we were gonna do. And it turns out, without any really clear direction on what are we working toward, and without any ability to really clearly communicate to families and to students what progress they were making, it's not particularly effective. And so we had to do some significant revamping over the first few years to say, we have to have some clarity. And so we developed our own internal competency-based system that is based in a lot of feedback and revision and partnerships. And so it really has. I'm proud to say that over time we have developed something that really is working quite well. So then the question becomes, how do you scale it? And we also then had the opportunity of being co-located with a traditional high school who probably about 5 years ago started the conversation, read your book. We're really having those conversations. And I used to be that one that when they'd come talk to me about it, I'd say, sure, we can talk about it as long as you call it assessment for learning, not grading for learning. Then I started to have to actually really think about how do you do this in a place like Middleton High School with people who really want to change what they're doing. And so then I had the opportunity to really think through, what are the steps that you have to take in a traditional place that you can't possibly say we're getting rid of grades and have the community or the students or the staff go along with you. And so I've had the opportunity to do some thinking about that as well.
Thank you. Dr. Patel.
Yeah, so you're asking, did we start with equitable grading or did we start with competency-based education, right? And how did those two swirl around each other? And in San Leandro, it was really neither was sort of in the driver's seat, neither was the lead. It was really this pursuit of uncovering the hidden curriculum in our schools. And let me set the stage for you to kind of understand why that was important for us. We're a town that is, well, let's start this way. Have you ever eaten a piece of Ghirardelli chocolate? Yeah. And you think, what city? I know, but it's made in San Leandro. If you've ever had fancy Torani syrup as a flavoring in your espresso in the morning, yeah, you might be thinking San Francisco, but it's really made in San Leandro. Yeah. And so over time, our community across the bay from San Francisco has been a town of industry, highly working class. 80% of our families are experiencing low socioeconomic status, right? So they need our schools to be a place of public health. They need for us to get things done for kids at school, right? And we're serving mostly a Black and brown population where half the families are multilingual. There's a diversity of 38 languages in our community. And so it's really one of the most racially and linguistically diverse spots in the country. And with that comes a lot of promise and a lot of distrust of what happens in school, right? So you don't get to come around with fun new acronyms and initiatives. You really have to talk to people from a place of what they're experiencing first. And what folks were experiencing, and this came out just resoundingly in parent engagement, in student forums, because at the time that I started this work about 10 years ago, we were a new leadership team. We had a new superintendent, a board who was really engaged in wanting to reverse the traditional notion of what our schools could do. When we started really listening, we were hearing that there was a sense of like a pedagogy of poverty going on. There was this belief that everything needed to kind of get back to basics, just really get, right, kids into learning just, math and reading, and not really, folks weren't really feeling like our schools were a place that were leading to the promise that they knew even the teaching staff was capable of, that when that was happening, it was sort of despite the system. And so what we were learning about is that there was this hidden curriculum, and in it, grading was quietly one of the most powerful teachers. And it was teaching lessons that no one really wanted and no one really intended. It was valuing compliance over creativity. So our teachers who were working hard, this was before we brought in Buck Institute of Education and project-based learning and all kinds of place-based learning. Even before we brought all that, we had teachers, right, who were just, resilient. Bringing in that kind of learning, they were finding that they weren't able to really capture the kind of creativity and place-based learning and competencies that students were bringing because our systems were valuing compliance. We were valuing punctuality over progress, right? When did you turn it in versus what you got? Let me see it. What are you learning? We were valuing privilege over persistence. And that speaks to some of the grade inflation that Joe was talking about, that there was a tendency to sort of help kids get ahead when they found that they were getting behind by giving extra credit or creating projects that really had big gatekeepers around them. So as we began to really uncover that, we realized that grading has really great PR. Traditional grading, it's always on TV. When you talk about grading on TV, it's A, B, C, D, F, right? That if we were going to upset that, if we were going to change the story of how kids saw themselves in our schools and how teachers were able to give them feedback, that it was going to require a really large shift for us. And so we doubled down into creating a new graduate profile that valued ethical and cultural leadership, healthy mind and body, different competencies, and we really talked about where that communication should happen, that it should be not necessarily baked into the grade that was on the report card. We doubled down on also project-based learning at that time, really getting our teachers trained up in arts integration and technology integration. And as they started to do the work that necessarily comes with that kind of pedagogy, they began to really ask themselves, what am I assessing? And how am I assessing? And at that time, they realized that our grading system really betrayed them. It really limited what they were able to say and do and show to families. So during that process of sort of having to, push upon the system that they were given, we realized that the grading practices that had become sort of standard, that they had become picked up with inheriting the course of study, the syllabi from the department chair, and using it without ever having had any formal training, right? 95% of our teachers said that they had never had any formal training on grading in their teacher education program. So they were just doing what was sort of common practice from what they had experienced in schools and what was in the course of study. As we began to uncover that, we realized that they needed to be able to go through deep teacher action research. They had to become owners of being able to see how these practices, these invisible teachers, these lessons were compromising what they really wanted to do in the classroom around the kind of learning that they were starting to build around project-based learning, around competency-based education. So that, I think the framing around really looking at the pedagogy of poverty that was sort of endemic to the system, that created this authentic need to really look at grading practices and seeing that those grading practices, when we were working on them over here, but as we were building the kind of teaching and learning that couldn't be measured or articulated or represented in a really high quality way to families and to our community, that disconnect sort of helped those two initiatives, get braided together. And we realized you really can't do one without another. If you're doing competency-based education and you're laying that on top of a really broken traditional grading system, it's going to be limiting. And if you're engaging in equitable grading work and really looking at those practices, if you're not really thinking about how you measure progress over time, right? That the most recent work is the valuable work, that's where the story is, that becomes limiting as well.
Thank you. And now, adults spend a lot of time talking about grading, but it's the students who get all the grades. So I'm so grateful that we have a student's voice here in this conversation. So Ray, if you could talk a little bit about, like, when did you notice that at your school things were different in grading or how you got feedback and in the kind of work that you were doing?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, at Clark Street Community School, it's no secret, right, that we are different by design. Thank you. You know, a lot of the things that you talk about with how traditional grading really fails students and fails their engagement are things that students learn at Clark Street right away. You know, we believe that students should really have a say in their education, also really deeply know how to learn and about learning. I think in the classroom, like my experience in the classroom is really like the greatest demonstrator and the greatest teacher I've had on competency-based education. Content at Clark Street is taught, but you're also expected to be a very active participant in your learning. You are supposed to take, you know, what the teacher is explaining to you and think, how is this relevant to the world today? How is this relevant to me, my identity, my passions? And we're expected to think critically and analyze this information as well as consume it. So at Clark Street, we measure our content in content pieces that we call elements, and these are like our credits, and then also artifacts, which is our projects in which we build our skills. So our elements are assessed in a pass-fail type of grading system, right? We don't want to say, we won't accept like you have an 80% understanding of this area of expertise. We want you to have mastery of this area of expertise. And then our artifacts, you know, our research papers, our math modeling skills, our argumentative writing skills. These are things that we need to practice over and over again to refine our skills. A very, very important piece of this is feedback, which is really, I think, a great connector between equitable grading and competency-based education. So feedback comes in many forms. It comes from our peers, right? When we're in process and we ask our peers, does this make sense to you? Is this effective to you? Do you understand what I'm trying to communicate? It comes in the form of writing conferences where we are connecting with professionals, oftentimes our instructors, and saying, tell me how I can do better on this. Teach me how I can make this more effective. And then, of course, at the end, when it's graded on a rubric. And you talked a lot about making grades transparent. The rubric is, in my experience, the most transparent grading system that I've encountered. It will tell me every single category that is being graded on my project. It will tell me how well I've done in these categories. You know, within a project, maybe I had incredible content. I researched this topic very deeply, and I expressed my ideas well, but my organization was off, and that affected how effective it was. I really like to see the rubric as a roadmap to improvement, right? Maybe in my freshman year when I was 14 years old and I was writing my first argumentative writing paper, of course it wasn't perfect. Of course I got many things wrong, but I looked at this rubric, I saw the places where I needed improvement, and I knew that I would have chances to try again. And I think that is incredibly important. I really want to talk about a personal story. I think, you know, my expertise in this area is my personal experience, right? At a very young age, I was diagnosed with dyslexia, and I was very fortunate to have a very supportive family who was able to provide me with hours of private tutoring from very skilled professionals who got me to a point of being literate, right? But going into high school, I thought, like, my opinion of myself was that I would never be able to be a good writer. I could write, I could read, but I thought that because of the way my brain worked, I would never be able to succeed. My greatest goal was just to keep up with my peers. At Clark Street Community School, though, I encountered a culture that was both high support, but also high expectation. My instructors and my community were the first to tell me, Ray, I looked at this paper, and there are things you need to change. I know you can do better, and here's how I will help you to do better. Here's how I will instruct you so that you can change and build this skill. I was being assessed on, right, like my ability to build a skill rather than, say, like my grammar or my spelling. Those things were not as important as maybe my innate ability to tell a story or my ability to comprehend knowledge and share it in a way that is effective to spread the word about something that I'm passionate about, something like that. And a part that was very transformative for me personally was that with this assessment style, I began to see that this was an assessment of my skill level, right? I was developing a skill. This assessment or this grade was not an assessment of my intelligence or me as a person. This assessment acknowledged that I could grow and that I could change, and it wanted me to grow and it wanted me to change. And that was extremely impactful for me as someone who had very low self-esteem and was very insecure about my skills and my ability as a writer.
Great. Wow, I feel like we could just like say that's a wrap, and like, that would be it. I'll address Dr. Gertner. You know, one of the things we heard as Ray was talking was like this really ownership of a different kind of language and vocabulary of what learning is. Things from, it wasn't 80%, it was mastering compliance, and rubrics make it transparent and give me roadmaps. And just that whole nomenclature of understanding themselves as learners is something that first has to start with helping the teachers understand this. And that's a very foreign language, I think, to a lot of teachers, unfortunately. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you help teachers start to think differently, not as grading as these technical fixes, but as larger ideas and larger sort of schema around what teaching and learning is with new kinds of language.
Yeah. First of all, thank you, Ray. Whew. I thought through how am I going to handle being in front of a big audience? I didn't quite think through how am I going to handle that. So I am a big fan of Zaretta Hammond's work. And coming out of the pandemic, Zaretta Hammond had a quote out there about the fact that a pedagogy of compliance, the fear of us shifting to a pedagogy of compliance, and it relates a lot to what Dr. Patel was talking about as well. So I now try to use the concept of really transparently talking with students, talking with staff, talking with families, that our goal in this work is to move from a pedagogy of compliance to a pedagogy of collective agency. And you heard the students talking about it yesterday. I've heard it in many, many, many different spaces, of the importance of the fact that this is a collective. This is work that we are doing together. It's work that the adults and the young people are doing in partnership. And Ray hit the high support and high expectations. So it's, for me, really important that we are very transparent about that and that we keep coming back to it. That whether you're starting in a traditional, highly successful setting and trying to talk about how do you grade more equitably, or whether you're in the Barbie Dream House where you've had the opportunities to start from competency, it's still all about shifting our mindset and shifting our practices and honoring the fact that the system as it's built is built for compliance. It's not built for engagement. It's not built for collective agency, and that we have to say that. We have to talk about it because we will all fall back into it if we don't. Then I think there are, there's resources out there to teach people the practices, to teach adults the practices of partnership, the practices of mentorship. If you haven't read David Yeager's 10 to 25 yet, I highly recommend that. It is full of the research about mentorship and the power of mentorship. And I think then we need to be teaching those skills. And we need to allow space, both for people to change their beliefs, right? Some of us come here and we hear these young people and we're like, yes, I'm going back and I'm going to do it tomorrow, and of course we're going to do this. And that's a great place to start. It's a great place to work to get to people there. That's not how everyone gets there. And there's a lot of really valid reasons for why people can't get there that way. And so I think it's also really important to do the work of changing practices and then help people see how those changing practices connect to the bigger picture. And then finally, I would say it's really important as a leader to remember that the educators are also caught in a system that is not designed for collective agency. And sometimes we're so eager to get there that we forget that, and we disempower educators even more than they already are.
Thank you. Dr. Patel, related to that, so we're trying to get teachers who are in the system, who have maybe even found success in the system, to think about it differently. And parents and families are a really important constituent of schools. And we have to, just like you disabuse people that San Francisco is not where Ghirardelli chocolate's made, and people are like, no, I wanted it to be San Francisco. Now we have to disabuse parents like, oh, this grading system that you may have in fact been successful in is actually harmful. And the work you've been doing to support your kid is actually not the work that we're going to be doing here. Talk about how do you engage and help families move through that process?
Yeah, I think it's important to make space for, well, as you pointed out, right, teachers themselves are sort of suffer under this kind of a setting. And so we know that we can't make the change we need to make unless families understand what we're doing. And part of that requires families to be able to sort of understand that teachers, in learning about dismantling inequitable grading practices, around moving towards competency-based education, it's gonna be an up and down process. It's gonna be vulnerable. You're gonna put out your syllabus, then you're gonna be like, nope, I wanna change it. Oh, I'm gonna grade this way, nope, I'm gonna change that. And it's gonna be this, cyclical thing that happens, and it's highly vulnerable. And as much as we can all say that we want our educators to be continual learners, on back to school night, families wanna know what's gonna happen. And it feels like you have to solidify everything. And so something that we had to really think about in San Leandro was creating the condition by which we could really speak to families in a super frank way, in a really honest way. And so as we began to tell them the story of what grades were doing to us as a school system, traditional grading, right? And the limits of our grading software and the history and the legacy of sorting students and just valuing efficiency over what students actually know, right? And what they want to be able to do. As we began to talk about that, we had to talk about everything else too. So you don't get to just make grading or competency-based education your only initiative. Because when you start to tell families, hey, guess what? Our grades, they're really variable. They're kind of inconsistent. They don't let kids like Ray show up the way they need to show up. When you start to tell them that, they're gonna tell you all the other things in your school. Oh, you know what, Dr. Patel? I see you're taking notes. Go ahead and add this on your list. Why is this way? And why is the school lunch this way? And if you value a healthy mind and body, then explain this to me, right? They will use the very tools that you're using to sort of benchmark or hold as a compass or a North Star, right? Like our graduate profile, to show you the contradictions, right? To show you where the rubber doesn't meet the road. And you know what? They should. They should. That's exactly why we built the graduate profile. Hold me to it. That's exactly why we want the rubric, right? Hold me to it. Hold me to it. But parents aren't going to believe you right away if you come in talking about the inequities of grading, without giving them space to talk about their whole story around it. So something we learned to do very quickly in San Leandro was really engage our family, our parent leadership groups. We have DLACs, right, our District English Language Advisory Council, and it's a fierce group of folks who are really learning about what their students deserve. They're learning about dually identified students. You might be an English learner and you have an IEP. And so as they hold that kind of complexity, we're starting to show them the complexity around grading, right? Because they'll say things like, well, I don't understand why that teacher just let my student turn that in so late. That's not going to help them when they go off to college. I mean, it's like they're letting them, right, be, you know, like they're getting away with it. Anyone ever heard that? Yeah. So as much as we talk about, you know, we're doing project-based learning and we want multiple cycles of critique and revision and all that kind of stuff, our parents are like, what are you talking about? I'm trying to get my kid out of the door on time. And we need to have that understanding that we're sort of all wrapping around our student together. So we had to walk them through how some of those values that we still value in other parts of our school day, how they have to be separated from the grades. This means literally we walked our families through syllabi, showing them the inconsistency, being really honest about the grading. That slide that Joe showed of the biology teachers, that's us. And we're a one high school town, 2,800 kids, one comprehensive senior high school. So there's no other choice. You don't get to choose, right? A different form of learning, a different place to go. So we have to make it all happen there. So we had to be really honest with them about the mountain that our teachers were facing, that this kind of learning would take years and years of unwrapping things, and that it starts not in high school, not even in middle school. It starts all the way down in elementary school by how we give feedback, by how our 4th and 5th grade teachers think they're helping by starting to use, right, some of the traditional grading that they think they're getting kids ready for, and we're like, stop, don't, please, don't help us. Keep doing your thing. So having those family groups and then having those families be ambassadors to other families, right? Because, and then really bringing the work that our teachers were doing, and we couldn't have done this work without the foundation of teacher action research, because that model builds collective efficacy. We needed teachers to feel in charge of their learning. So as they did that, we took those stories to the board and we took them to the union, because those two groups had to be at the table with us.
Thank you. Yeah, when we partner with schools and districts, that action research and making it very public among teachers and then into larger groups about what teachers are finding, what data they're collecting, what they're sharing, is really the key, one of the key levers. Dr. Chang, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, with those schools that you mentioned, you know, that come from the Coalition of Essential Schools, really innovative models. What does it look like? What does assessment look like, and what does feedback look like in those places?
Yeah. Microphone time. I also know that we've got less than 3 minutes. So
I'm not looking at that.
Yeah, like they're like on stage. So I'm going to answer that, and I'm going to kind of maybe offer up some closing thoughts and some advice here, right? And I want to speak about the fact that the work that we do in New York, I think, is tremendously powerful because it shows an example of this at scale. 22,000 students that come from both the South Bronx to Staten Island, from Flushing, Queens to Flatbush, Brooklyn, and it really is a place where across every single school, across every grade, in every classroom, this sense of ownership and understanding of learning through projects, of a defense of their work in a public setting is deeply integrated, and that has taken many, many steps forward and many steps back along the way. And so when I think about sort of the key things to offer up, you know, here's what I would say to others who are taking on this work, that you have to start with coherence. That whether you enter through equitable grading or competency-based learning, really ultimately the goal is the same. Fairness and rigor have to be within the same system. And so when school districts start with grading reforms by eliminating zeros or rethinking late work and just stops there, this policy might look cleaner, but the learning underneath might actually end up staying the same. And if you start with this idea of a mastery progression, but if every teacher defines mastery in a different way, then the reporting is actually opaque, and that's actually not fair, right? Neither approach works on its own. You really need to be able to have both. and grades have to tell the truth about learning. Next, I think you have to build trust early and to be able to keep that work public. So Sona, the stuff that you talked about, that like families and students have been burned by grading their whole lives, and teachers too. So you have to prove that this is not code for lowering standards, and that the fastest way of doing that, in our example, is by making the student work visible. Bring real artifacts into those conversations. If you were fortunate enough to hear Ron Berger just 2 days ago, he talks about making sure that you are having students in there and faculty meetings, board meetings, parent nights, let people see that rigor. And finally, let's be really honest about what it is that we're trying to change. If what you want is slightly higher test scores, this is not the thing that's going to get you that. But what you want is schools where every single person, especially those where the system is underestimated, and you can point to real evidence of their thinking, growth, and potential, then this is the work. Because in the end, this kind of grading is where our values become visible. And if we want a different kind of learning, then you have to start to tell the truth about what it is that we value.
Yeah. So we are about at time, unfortunately, but one of the things that I want to highlight is that when we start talking about grading with teachers and parents and families, there are a lot of folks who have been burnt by grading, and it will surface that for them, and it will validate that it wasn't them. It was the system that actually exacted this harm from them, and they might become even the most powerful advocates for this work because they know the harm that their students might be experiencing. These folks will be around for the rest of the conference. I'll be around doing a workshop this afternoon at 1:45, and books are available if you'd like them. Please help me thank these wonderful participants for this work.